Alright, so you're 17, you've finally deleted League of Legends from your hard drive, and you've just downloaded Valorant. Where do you go from here? Well, believe it or not, most esports titles are not primed for playing from the start. You need to optimize your settings if you want the best chance at competing. And for that, most people look to the pros. The fact is, for every game, there are so-called God settings. Settings that the vast majority of serious players all seem to have in common. You probably wonder why every time you pop into a pro player stream, viewers are constantly spamming things like !sends or !res. Now, these settings can change from game to game, setup to setup, and of course, player to player. But we're here to help you figure it out. We're here to help you make sure that you are getting the best possible performance no matter what game you're playing. Because when you're playing a game and it is running smooth as hell, chances are, so are you. Alright, so this week we've decided to team up with AMD to help you get your favorite games running as cleanly as possible. Whether it's hardware settings or in-game settings, we want to set you up for success so you can continue to pop heads in the server. Alright, so as I'm sure you all know, when you load up most games for the first time, they automatically detect what hardware you're using, and depending on how scuffed your setup actually is, adjust your settings accordingly. Now, these settings take into account what GPU or CPU you're using, and even how much RAM you have in order to give you the best possible image for your hardware. But the best picture doesn't always mean the best performance. And if you're playing a game in 1440p or 4K and it looks like a slideshow, then what's the point? Now, when most people start taking a game seriously, they tend to seek out certain settings that will supposedly give them an advantage in the server, even if it means making their game look like shit. And the way that people tend to start doing this is, naturally, to copy pro players. Whether it's through their streams or various websites, all of their settings are pretty easily accessible. But plugging in a pro player's sensitivity or resolution isn't gonna suddenly optimize your game perfectly. Not everyone is running the exact same hardware, and your personal settings will change game to game. In Valorant and CSGO specifically, I would recommend changing everything in your graphics settings to the lowest possible option and turning off any extra decorative features like motion blur. Turn off VSync too, because it might cause input lag. Multi-threaded rendering can stay on though. This will allow the game to fully make use of all the cores and video RAM in your CPU and GPU. In some games, like Rainbow Six Siege, turning things like shadows or LOD all the way down actually isn't a good idea. In the case of shadows, you can lose them entirely, and in the case of LOD, you can kind of make the perception of the hitboxes and all the operators weird, because they're going to look all square and pixelated. Now, Colten tells me that in Apex, you're going to want to disable FOV ability scaling to ensure that your mouse movements remain consistent while using certain legends like Octane. And I can't believe I'm about to give League players a helping hand, but in League of Legends, turning on colorblind mode can help a ton with visibility, especially in teamfights. We actually did a whole episode just on colorblind gaming. But what I will tell you is that adjusting certain settings can be beneficial for everyone. Actually, how about I just get Mr. actually knows what he's talking about to explain it to you, since y'all seem to like him better anyway. Fucking nerds.
And now, the guy who actually knows what he's talking about. Presented by AMD.
Dimitri talks a big game, but who do you think he calls when he has a hardware question? It's me. The answer's me. Settings are quite literally everywhere, not just in the game you're playing, but on all your different pieces of hardware as well. And heaven forbid you're a streamer too. But when it comes to esports, where you want performance over fidelity, the main thing you're aiming to do is lessen the demand on your computer's CPU and GPU. Your first step for freeing up CPU resources should be your out-of-game settings. Things like your PC's power settings and the CPU load from other programs running at the same time as your game. If you want to get really nerdy, you can even dig into your motherboard's BIOS settings and increase your CPU's clock speed. If you've ever seen PC nerds posting about overclocking, this is what they're talking about. Now, overclocking will increase the amount of heat your CPU generates, and can even make it unstable beyond a certain point, so I recommend doing plenty of research before you go down this road. When it comes to in-game settings, some can be pretty straightforward. Lighting effects and texture quality have a very obvious impact on the fidelity versus performance trade-off, but what about the settings that aren't so obvious? Take ambient occlusion, for example. This setting gives your scene a much more lifelike lighting, calculating how much ambient light should be reaching a certain point in the scene. While screen space ambient occlusion doesn't tax your CPU, other more detailed implementations will have a much higher impact on your system. What about another slightly confusing setting, like anti-aliasing, which is used to remove jagged lines in a frame? There are two categories that AA settings can fall into: supersampling and post-processing. Supersampling essentially generates a frame at a much higher resolution, then downscales that image to remove the jagged edges. Post-processing involves analyzing the frame after it's already rendered, and blurring jagged edges on a per-pixel basis, generally taxing your system a lot less. There are an absurd amount of four-letter acronyms for the different kinds of AA implementations in different games and from different graphics card manufacturers. So instead of me sitting here listing them all, you're gonna have to Google whichever acronym shows up in your game or GPU settings and figure out which category it's in and how large the impact on your hardware's performance will be. A solid majority of in-game settings are likely to impact your GPU performance, since it's the piece of hardware running all those calculations and then spitting out well-lit landscapes. But it's not always quite that simple. Your CPU also shares some of this workload. If you went out and splashed on a brand new graphics card and dropped it in your 5-year-old gaming rig, you aren't going to see the orders of magnitude increase in graphics or frame rate you were likely hoping for. That's why it's important to get a CPU and GPU of roughly the same power to avoid bottlenecks and get the maximum amount of performance for your money. Sorry, just out of respect, I want to make sure our boy Dimitri is keeping up with all this PC talk. You nodding off there, champ? You need us to play the simple falling op to help wake you up a little bit?
Colten, do me a favor. I am sending you some clips in Discord. Just check those out real quick.
What clips? 2 on A. Where did everybody go? Why would he check that? Why? Why on earth would he check that? In what universe does Dimitri check that?
Because I live rent-free in your head, son.
And that was the guy who actually knows what he's talking about. Presented by AMD.
In fast-paced shooters like Valorant, CSGO, and even Rainbow Six Siege, most players value their FPS above, well, everything. With high refresh rate monitors becoming increasingly affordable and accessible, players are now aiming for the highest possible frames per second to keep up with the refresh rate of their display. That's why most esports competitors make their game look like fucking Minecraft. They may look like crap, but they run way smoother. But when you're looking at all the different settings in-game, sometimes it just looks like gibberish. Like, what the hell is anisotropic filtering? And what do I do with it?
It's just a filter that helps with the clarity of textures when they appear at an angle relative to the camera. Come on, Dimitri.
Well, for that, I went to my boy Robert over at AMD. Throughout this episode, he's going to help us make sure that we are getting the best possible performance out of our hardware.
You could kind of be one of two different players. You could be the kind of player who's willing to give up some frames per second because you want the game to look better, or you can just crush all the game settings down to minimum quality, which raises your frame rates sometimes by a lot, depending on what the game has implemented. And some would even say can give you a competitive advantage because it makes enemy players stand out a little better in the scene. So you first have to decide what kind of player you want to be. Do you want better graphics or do you want higher frame rates? It's really hard to get both in the same game. You'll want to at least tune the settings such that your frame rate is pretty consistent at whatever refresh rate your monitor is. So you're going to need to look into that. You might have a 60 hertz monitor, 120 hertz, or heck, even like 280 or 300 these days. And you'll want to try to dial in a frame rate in the game that's very close or beyond what your monitor can do. And that means you're always seeing sort of the latest, most updated information from the game, which is especially important for games like CSGO or other twitchy shooters.
Now, when you go out and buy one of these expensive-ass monitors, you want your game to run smoothly. Because when the frame rate from your graphics card doesn't match up with your monitor's refresh rate, you might run into some issues.
If your video card is producing more or less frames than the monitor is updating its own picture. One is called tearing, where you have too many frames. It's the idea that all monitors refresh from top to bottom. They just do that over and over. And you can actually have 2 frames on the display at the same time. And it produces this horizontal line in your screen.
But to combat this issue, AMD developed their own technology, FreeSync, which is now widely used in gaming monitors along with the NVIDIA equivalent G-Sync. This allows your GPU and monitor to update at the same time, fixing screen tearing altogether. But us CS players, we tend to just crank our frames up even higher to solve the issue. Isn't that right, Robert?
What many CSGO players do, for example, is just run the frame rate so high and so fast, over 300 frames a second, that whatever tearing exists only lasts for a very, very short amount of time. And such that it may be imperceptible to the human eye because it comes and goes so quickly.
But there is one other issue that can arise if your GPU and your monitor aren't working in unison with one another.
The other issue that you can have is to solve that tearing, there is a technology called VSync, which makes the graphics card wait to produce a new frame to match the update rate of the display. It's not quite like FreeSync in that it causes occasional stuttering if you turn VSync on, because that pause time, that waiting on the monitor and the GPU to agree to an update can be random in time. And so that stuttering will make the game feel slow or choppy.
Now, from what Colten told me, your CPU and GPU work together to help pump out the most possible frames, manipulating texture data and other in-game elements stored in your system's RAM, and more importantly, your GPU's video RAM, or VRAM. But not too long ago, CPUs weren't able to make proper use of a graphics card's memory. Some top consumer-grade GPUs now have up to 16 gigs of dedicated video RAM. Imagine paying all of that money for a brand new graphics card and not even being able to make full use of it. AMD saw this as a massive problem, but they also saw it as an opportunity to change the way that GPUs and CPUs communicate with each other forever. So late last year, they launched this thing called Smart Access Memory.
It allows a Ryzen CPU and a Radeon graphics card to communicate with the full width of that graphics card's memory all at the same time. And AMD invented this technology. We were the first to bring this technology to market. And it's essentially free performance. We developed this thing that gives you extra performance in games that was hidden by an arbitrary limitation of the way CPUs and graphics cards had communicated for forever.
Smart Access Memory is quite literally a game changer. And even though it was initially designed for AMD users, because it's based on an open standard, gamers who continue to use Intel and NVIDIA powered products out of habit may be able to make use of it in the future. But lately, Ryzen CPUs have been king, especially when it comes to esports titles. Plenty of games like Counter-Strike, Valorant, and even League of Legends are all heavily CPU bound. And it seems like just about every top player or streamer is picking up AMD's 5950X to go alongside their 3090. You can get some pretty impressive frames with these Ryzen processors. Ryzens are quite simply the best on the market right now. Like, deadass. Sponsorship aside. Whether or not you're running them with a Radeon graphics card, if you're just an everyday gamer and or streamer, you can expect some pretty outstanding performance.
We're very agnostic. The point of our CPU business is to be the best damn processor we can be for every kind of gaming customer, whether they run Radeon hardware or GeForce or other competitive offerings in the future. We just want to be the best gaming CPU, and putting artificial limitations on our chip hurts us and it hurts gamers. And we really pride ourselves on the interoperability of our hardware with, frankly, competitive products.
So no matter what your setup looks like, these so-called God settings apply to everyone. If you want to take your game to the next level by boosting your frames, then lowering some of your settings is the first step. Because even if your game does look a little pixelated, when it's running smoothly, chances are you'll be able to pop heads just like some of your favorite pros. Graphics aren't everything, especially in esports. Okay, so for this week's episode, we've decided to team up with AMD to help you get your favorite game.
I've engendered the weebs, Dimitri.
You've engendered the weeb. Bro, the number of people that comment on like your mouse pad or wallpaper or whatever the fuck, I don't even understand. I don't no idea, bro. Like I've never even watched Naruto. Never mind like fucking whatever the fuck hardcore weeb shit you're into.